Welcome. Hello, and thanks for joining this webinar on Missions 3.0. I am Tom Bassford. I am the Executive Director and founder of Significant Matters. And a little framework that'll help you understand me and where we're coming from with all of this is that I pastored for over 30 years, and about 15 years ago started Significant Matters in large part just wrestling with what we have come to know as this toxic charity or when helping hurts kind of message, and wrestling with what it might look like for us to do missions in a little different way, to at least avoid the helping that hurts and toxic charity kinds of things that we've discovered over the time. So what I want to do this morning is give you a quick 1 hour overview of what we call Missions 3.0 introduction. And the best way for me to do that in the beginning, since there's, the awkward part about these webinars is that you can't see your audience out there. So I'm grateful for each of you that wanted to be a part of this. But I'd like to have a little bit of an idea of who all's out there. And so you should have the ability to take a poll. So would you help me out? I am going to launch the first polling. Just there's 3 questions in this. It'll help me have a little bit better idea of who's out there, so that as it comes up, there you go. You should be able to see each of these polling questions. And the first one is, which of the following best describes you? I'm a pastor, I'm a mission leader, I'm a business-minded person, I'm a nonprofit leader, or I am a mission volunteer. Just kind of good to get, there you go. So I'm getting a little bit of an idea. So there you go. And it looks to me that we've got, okay, so about 25% of you, I'm hoping, this is my first time doing this, so I hope you can see the poll. If not, I'll read it off to you. We've got 25% of you out there right now would label yourself as business-minded person. 44% are mission leaders. That's great, because a lot of what we have to say here really is aimed towards the mission leader, and you'll understand that a little bit more as we get into this. And 31% are nonprofit leaders, and that's pretty much as I would expect. And we have no pastors and nobody that identifies as a general volunteer. So that's great. This should be right in your wheelhouse for this particular audience. And then you'll see the second question there. The question is, what type of church do you attend? And the choices are a North American suburban church, a North American urban church, or a church outside of North America. So go ahead and take that poll if you would. And there you go. So let's see here. Outside North America, that's about 13%. The North American suburban church, that's 69%. And 19% of this audience says they are from an urban church. So again, and all of this will become a little clearer to you in a minute, but it's important for me to know so I can say a few things so you understand where we're coming from and who we're speaking to, why we're speaking the way that we are. I don't want anybody to feel like we aren't considering who you are and your particular place in missions as unimportant, but there is a specific group of people that we're trying to talk to through the Missions 3.0. And then the last thing I'd like to know is, what generational group do you find yourself in? So there they are, they're listed. Baby boomers before 64, Gen X, 65 to 80, millennials, 81 to 97, Gen Z after that. So take that real quick, and there you go. So thank you. So what I've got here is 56% of you on this webinar self-identify as baby boomers. So over half the group is baby boomers. And then 19% are in the Gen X group, and then 25% are millennials. So that is great. So just a little bit of an idea, and again, you'll see as we get into it, this Missions 3.0 is aimed primarily at the North American suburban church, not because we don't think churches outside of the United States are important or that the urban church is unimportant. That's not the issue. It's the message or the things that we're going to be wrestling with are things aimed specifically at what the North American suburban or the resource church can do differently in the world of missions, both locally and around the world. We're also focused on the mission leader and trying to help you as a mission leader understand some things that you can do in the reality of your world, and how we might be able to help you think through some of the dynamics that are going on in your mission work in particular. We say that our mission work is to help the North American church create more sustainable solutions to poverty and connect with business-minded people who can help that happen. So we'll talk a little bit about the importance of business-minded people in our church and how the church has failed in so many ways to create space for that group of people. But all of my experience tells me that when we begin to truly understand the kinds of things that our business-minded people can bring to the conversation and to the actual work of this kind of mission work, we'll begin to understand the great untapped resources that sit in the pews of almost every church out there right now. I am finding that that more and more baby boomers that are retiring healthier and wealthier than any other time in history really lean into the ideas behind this Mission 3.0 because they've been involved in charitable work. They've been involved in trying to make a difference. And as they have kind of worked through their own journey in that, they're asking themselves the question, is this going to last? What can we do to actually help people lift themselves out of poverty? And what I find also interesting is that millennials, at the other end of the spectrum, if you will, have no problem seeing the dynamic of the here and now and the hereafter, the church combining the two and asking and answering the question, how can we help people not just understand what it means to be right with God in the hereafter, but to also be deeply concerned about the here and now and the ways in which we can help people in material poverty break out of that. So that's great. But I've got another couple of polls that I want us to, that I'd like to have you take as well. So let me see if I'm going to end this poll and jump into the next one, which will also help me find out a little bit more about you. Let's go here. So what I want to do, here we go, I'm going to launch this. So what I'd like to know is, we call this defining missions by the verse. So I realize that we're all animated by all three of these verses, but I find that there's three broad verses that a lot of people sort of lean into that inform their understanding, and at least their passion about missions. And one is the Great Commandment out of Matthew 22. The other is the Great Commission out of Matthew 28. And then the third is the Golden Rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, out of Matthew 7. So look, I know that we probably all would say all three of these things are important to me, and that's fine, I got it. But if you had to kind of lean into one of these verses and say, this really is the primary motivator behind the kind of stuff, my understanding of missions, tell us what that would be. And I'll explain a little bit more to you about why that's important. So of the three, the Golden Rule, the Great Commandment, or the Great Commission, which of those three best represents what the verse that informs your passion about missions? Good. There you go. Okay, all right. So there it is. So the polling is in, and here's what I've got. That of those three verses, 13% of you say that you identify with the Golden Rule as that primary verse that sort of pushes you into missions and helps you understand it. 50% of you say that you're animated by the Great Commandment. So 50%, love God with all of your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And then 38% of you are saying the verse that most propels me into mission or informs my understanding of mission is the Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And so that's great. And so part of the reason this is important, and I'm going to take this poll off right now, and then I'm going to bring the third one up in just a minute, because I want to say again that I'm not saying that that one of these is more important than others. What I am finding is that as I have stepped into conversations about missions, and specifically as we try to work through Missions 3.0, it's important for me up front to kind of say what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. And because we're not talking about one or the other doesn't mean it's not important, but that people can be impassioned about missions based on a number of different scriptural passages out there. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of what is behind the Missions 3.0 thing just a second after we take this final poll. So let's go to the last one. And boy, I am just now figuring out how to do all this. So thank you for your patience. Here we go. And so this one we call, let's do it, let's launch it. There it is. This is called missions by activity. So again, all of these things may be important to you, but when you think about missions, what do you typically bring to mind? And I've given you 5 different categories, broad categories. So when you think of missions, what captures your priority around the idea of missions? Is it disciple-making movements? The whole idea of the disciple-making movements, there's a lot of different groups around the world right now that identify as disciple-making movements. Do you think of serving the poor and marginalized? Is that what comes to your mind when you think about missions? Evangelism, that's a third category. Is that what comes to your mind when you think about missions? And then unreached people groups. Is that what comes to your mind? And finally, church planting. So, excuse me, of those 5, which of those 5 best describe realizing that maybe all 5 of them are important? There you go. Good, good. So this is great for me to see this right up front. So let me tell you what I'm finding here. That of this group, 13% of you say that what comes to your mind, what the priority for you is unreached people groups around the world. 25% of you say that you think of disciple-making movements. 13% of you are thinking evangelism, and 50%, half of this group, is thinking in terms of serving the poor and marginalized. And all of this is so typical, the way in which we find ourselves all over the page, if you will, when it comes to missions. And so hear me now as we kind of jump into this. Missions 3.0 really focuses on the idea of material poverty. And if one of those verses was to be the animating force behind Missions 3.0, it would probably be the Golden Rule. Not because I don't believe in the Great Commission or the Great Commandment. I absolutely do. I come from an evangelical background. I understand such things as Bible translation projects. I understand the 1040 window. I understand unreached people groups, the perspectives class, and all of those things are deeply important to me. But that's not what compelled me into the kind of work that we're doing around Missions 3.0 right now. What compelled me into this was as I began to look at the mission work that we were doing as a church in my own ministries out there, I realized that more and more of that, pretty much all of that work was being done in the context of poverty, material poverty, in which people just simply didn't have the resources or the means to take care of themselves. And a couple of things happened over time, but I began to look at and realize that if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't want a vacation Bible school. I wouldn't want many of the things that the Western church brings when it comes into places of poverty. What I would want is I would want the means and the wherewithal to be able to take care of my family and my needs the same way these volunteers were coming in to my community and taking care of not only their own needs, but they're taking care of my needs. And so I began to see that in many ways it was the golden rule that ought to begin to inform what we do in the way of poverty alleviation. Now, again, please hear me. I'm not saying the Great Commission is not important. I'm not saying that these things don't all fit together. What I am saying is to the extent that the church, and I'm talking about the North American church, primarily the North American suburban church, because it's the North American suburban church that tends to mobilize and deploy resources into various places, both domestically and internationally. And it's the way in which those resources are mobilized and deployed that has created the narrative of helping that hurts, and toxic charity, and poverty cures work, and Dambisa Moyo's book, Dead Aid, and all of those kinds of things come because of the way that we mobilize and deploy resources, financial and otherwise, into the context of poverty. And all I'm saying to the North American church is, look, to the extent that you work in poverty, we need to be well informed about the best ways in which we address material poverty, and liken it to the way in which we address things like education, or the way that we address things like medical kinds of things. The church was at the forefront of those things in the past. And for the church to retain its integrity, it needed to be able to deal with medical issues in the best possible ways, to not fake remedies, not fake education, not complicate health issues or educational issues in the process, but to find out really what were the kinds of things that would help people medically. What were the things that would really help people educationally? And how could we be a part of those kinds of things? Well, the same thing is going on in the world of poverty right now. And what we've discovered in this country, ever since Johnson's War on Poverty to this date, again, to Dambisa Moyo's book, Dead Aid, and others, is that many of the things, the unintended consequences of this giveaway mentality has made things worse than better. And that there's lots of things that we have to learn about material poverty if it is that we're going to be able to offer the best that the church has to offer in the realm of material poverty. So we're going to be talking in large part to the North American suburban church, and we're going to be talking about material poverty and ways in which we as churches through our mission work could participate in that and actually begin to innovate new ideas and new ways of working with the poor. And I believe that as we do that, the North American church will find its relevance in our communities skyrocket. I think that we will begin to erase that line between secular and sacred. I think that people who are looking for a reason to believe that the church is relevant will find it in the church that not only holds to its message of the gospel, but also knows how to help people, as we like to say, not just in the hereafter, but also in the here and now. So I said in some of the promotion that we sent out that one of the things we would do is I'd share the single most important thing that the North American church could do to alleviate poverty. I mean, if there was one thing that the North American suburban church could do that would change its role in poverty alleviation, it would be to change the end goal. And let me give you a story about what I mean by that. So when we first started Significant Matters, we did a conference called Beyond Talk, in which we brought together urban and suburban ministries, churches from across the city, as well as ministries. And we were simply trying to ask the question, how might we partner together differently? How could we do missions differently? Because everybody agreed that there was a lot of frustrations about the way the suburban, primarily Anglo church was trying to work in the urban core, primarily with African American and Latino congregations. And so we brought in some people who could speak to the whole issue. We gave people a chance to share their thoughts and their ideas. And one of the things that we had learned from that, those of us from the suburbs, over time we've learned that whether it's in this country or outside of this country, that we're oftentimes perceived because we do have this Messiah complex. We think that we've got all the answers, and so we come in with these ideas, and we expect those that we're partnering with to simply work our ideas. And so we had decided that we were not going to have any agenda, that what we simply wanted to do was figure out how might we partner together differently and better. How might primarily Anglo churches partner better with primarily African-American churches in the urban core? And as we came out of this conference, no great insights happened to us in this time, but what we were committed to was building a deeper relationship between the leaders of urban and suburban churches. And so we started to meet together twice a month for lunch. And we had this solid agreement that we would continue to build those relationships and have conversations until we could come to the point where it became obvious to all of us how we might partner together differently. We couldn't even describe what that might look like. We just knew that what we were doing wasn't working. And it took us 4 years of meeting twice a month around a lunch table, talking, and we would float ideas and we would try to do certain things, and it wouldn't make sense to different ones at the table. And after just about 4 years, here's what happened. One day at lunch, one of the African-American pastors said, okay, I'm going to risk this. I'm going to say it. He said, I am sick and tired of being a positive volunteer experience for rich white folks from the suburbs. Wow. And just like that, the mission pastor from the largest United Methodist Church, I think it's the largest United Methodist Church in the world, was at the table. They were a part of this group, a huge United Methodist Church. Their mission pastor had been a part of this from day one. And just that quick, he retorted with, and yes, I'm tired of feeling like an ATM machine every time I walk in the room. And it got dead quiet. And we looked around the table and said, is anybody leaving? And everybody said no. But you see, what happened in that conversation was that I'm not sure any of us could have articulated it until these two men said what they said. But that the way in which we had been partnering together, it felt as though the whole reason for a partnership was to provide positive volunteer experiences for, as this pastor said, rich white folks from the suburbs. And the rich white folks from the suburbs felt like they were simply an ATM machine to keep the lights on at this church. And so once we could agree that that really is what it felt like, then we had to begin to ask ourselves, okay, if that's not what we're going to partner for, if there are better reasons to partner than just a positive volunteer experience or the exchange or the sharing of resources so that you can keep the lights on, what would it be? And we began to wrestle with that along the idea of community development and those kinds of things, material poverty. And what we finally came up with that everybody around the table could agree with was simply this. What if we partnered together? And this is what I mean by changing the end goal. The end goal was no longer about having enough suburban churches to keep the lights on in the urban core, nor was it about having enough urban partnerships to keep all of your volunteers busy. What if it became about partnering in such a way that we could change the quality of life for people living within walking distance to this urban church that this pastor was a part of? What if the whole of that partnership could be that we might make that urban church a hero in their own community, and not just for the people who already attend their church, but also for those who live within walking distance of their church? Wow, what a difference that might make. And so we then began to wrestle with what that would look like. And it turned our world upside down, and we began to have to change all kinds of things that we were doing. We had to begin to admit some things that were going on in the dynamics that we were a part of within our church partnerships and those kinds of things. So what came from that then was what we call the co-op. And the co-op was this group of churches, urban and suburban churches, working to change the quality of life for urban neighborhoods in partnership with the local churches in those districts. And man, it was built along the lines of what Bob Lupton has done around the key result areas of housing, education, job creation, and those kinds of things. But we began to wrestle with how we might be able to work together in those sorts of ways to change the quality of life for people within those neighborhoods. So I want to stop and say something I meant to say at the very beginning, that we mean for this to be a conversation, and we will take time throughout the webinar to answer your questions and those kinds of things. And so if you've got them, please feel free to throw out your questions, and I promise you that we will answer whatever comes. If we don't get to them, I will circle back at the end of this and we'll answer all of your questions as well. So here's the first thing that we would say, and this has been really hard for the work that we have done with primarily suburban churches, is to say to them, whether we want to admit it or not, we have elevated the volunteer experience for our people to be one of the, or in many cases, the primary goal and the need to create positive volunteer experiences for the people in our congregations. And I want to make a case for how that has lent itself to the helping that hurts, and how it is the number one thing that we have to move. We have to admit that our need to create positive volunteer experiences has driven much of what we currently see as helping that hurts. And there's ways for us to begin to kind of wrestle with that and what it might look like if we were to change some things. So you should have a handout here. I hope you do. Did everybody out there get a handout? Somebody send me something in the chat room. Yes, good. So great. If you don't have the handout for this, feel free to send me your email address and I'll send you the handout that you can kind of follow along where we're at right now. So as we began to work the co-op, we began to work with a number of churches. We began to work with the UMKC, a university in the neighborhood in the Kansas City area right here. And I'd like to answer the question at kind of the beginning here of why would anybody even want to work with the church? I mean, why should the church even be interested in this kind of stuff? And so we got invited to speak at a social entrepreneurship program that was being hosted at UMKC at the Kaufman Center here in the Kansas City area. And they invited the co-op along with one of the UMKC professors to give kind of a plenary sessions talk about the work that we were doing together in the way of housing, in the way of education, in the way of job creation and social services. And it was really an honor. And I remember thinking, okay, I think I want to create I'd like to create a secular value proposition. Now, we never wanted to hide the fact that we were a group of churches trying to tackle this, because we wanted to make the statement that we believe that churches could play a significant role in helping to address material poverty and help people lift themselves out of poverty. So I decided, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off with a simple statement. So we had our mission statement up behind us, and it had something to do with the church. It had something to do. It even had Jesus in the wording of it. And it wasn't to beat anybody over the head with our particular sense of the gospel. It was to simply identify that we were church-going believers who wanted to bring the resources that God had given us to bear upon this huge need. So I started out my talk by saying, if I were an atheist, now I'm not, but if I were an atheist, I would still want to work with the church. And it was really cool because I looked around the audience, I could tell that I had everybody's attention at that point. And I started to go through, there's 4 reasons. So even if I were an atheist, I'd want to work with the church. Here's why. 1, the church is the greatest mobilizer of funds. There's no other organization worldwide that mobilizes more dollars for the poor and the marginalized than the church. And you can see people all across the room kind of shaking their head. Yeah, we know that to be true. And I said, we can't do this in some sort of a market economy. I mean, this is going to take donated dollars. This is going to take benevolent dollars to be a part of it. So the solution is going to require that. No other organization raises as much money as the church. The second reason I'd want to work with the church is because there's no other organization that mobilizes more volunteers than the church. And we're not going to do this with paid help. I mean, this is going to take people willing to give of their time and talent as well as their money to be able to figure out some of these intractable problems that we're wrestling with, housing and food shortage and all kinds of things that come along with poverty. It's going to take a tremendous amount of volunteer help and human resources there. So the third reason I'd want to work with the church is because it's in the DNA of the church. The church has always been the first in and the longest to stay. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about leper colonies or whether we're talking about poor, or whatever the case is, throughout the whole history of the church has always been the first in and the longest to stay among the poor and the marginalized out in the world. But what other organization has its leaders stand in a pulpit once a week and preach from passages like, "Inasmuch as you've done it for the least of these, you've done it for me," or the Good Samaritan? I mean, it's a given that churches are supposed to be groups of people that care about material poverty in real and tangible ways. And then the fourth reason I'd want to work with the church is because it's got the greatest delivery system in the world. There's a church on every corner. I mean, there's churches everywhere around the world. And everybody would agree that the church has been incredible at delivering what we would call emergency relief and individual betterment. And I simply ask the question, if the church could become as proficient in participating in and innovating sustainable solutions as we have been with betterment things that build capacity and relief things that provide emergency. If we could become as good at sustainable development as we have at relief and betterment, wouldn't you want to work with the church? And I've not had anybody anywhere in the country where I've shared this say, no, we wouldn't want to work with the church. Matter of fact, I've had over and over and over again, people come to me and say, boy, I would love to work with the church in these kinds of ways. So I give you all of this as kind of a background to what it is that we're talking about. And to the extent that we may not touch on some things that you're really passionate about, please don't assume that we don't think those things are important. It's what God has called me to do, at least in this stage in my life, is to help the church wrestle with the very best things it could do when it's doing things in material poverty. And I would argue 90% of the work that the church does, mainline, evangelical, it doesn't matter. 99% of the work that we do is in the context of material poverty. Shouldn't we be some of the smartest? Shouldn't we have some of the most daring kinds of initiatives going on in that space to demonstrate that we believe God cares as much about a person's material poverty as he does about their spiritual poverty? And I don't think we have to choose between the two. I think he means for us to be able to do both. So let me look. In terms of, I want to take a second. So we do have a question here. Let me see that question. So, okay. So somebody asked the question, what were you able to do? Tell us something successful you were able to do through this co-op. So I talked about the co-op. Well, it's interesting. So, the number one successful thing that we tried to do, and this, I want to say the co-op was in existence for about 6 to 8 years, and it eventually, for all kinds of reasons, it eventually disbanded. But I don't see it at all as a failure. Matter of fact, one of the things that we wanted to do was to help change the quality of life for people within walking distance of this urban church. And so we were doing some things in the way of job creation. We were doing some things in the way of home ownership and things like that. And the one area that we succeeded, and we learned all kinds of lessons in the process from it, was a thing that we called good neighbor housing, in which we were trying to figure out how we could get people into home ownership. Because think about that. The number one asset that all of us in middle class and above have is most likely it's our home. And yet people in impoverished areas and people in poverty in general never own that kind of an asset. So we began to say, okay, how could we help somebody get into home ownership? And there were lots of properties in this neighborhood that were foreclosed, that we could get for next to nothing. And so we started the Good Neighbor Housing Program, and in that, it was built around this church, this urban church, identifying families that could handle a mortgage. And then they would spend time with this family. We would work with them, but then we would work together to bring together the resources necessary to help that person get into home ownership. And it was an incredible thing, because one of the persons that became a part of the co-op was the former CEO of a credit union. And what we wanted to do here was not just give a house to somebody and pat ourselves on the back, but could we make the system work for people who otherwise could never own a home? So here was a gentleman with a felony background and was unable. I mean, he was living in a horrible situation, but was making something out of his life and just really needed some help. And so he and his family were identified, and this urban church worked with them. And what we began to do then is we went into the credit union and we said, look, we want to rehab this house, and then we want you to make a 15-year loan to this individual. And we don't want it to be a gift. The only thing we want you to do is give us a chance and tell us what we need to do to make this work for you so that the bank regulators would not be suspicious of this. And they worked with us. They worked with us through the whole process. Now, here's the crazy thing. We ended up spending 3 times more than we needed to on rehabbing this house because we got taken advantage of 2 or 3 times in the urban core. And that's with working with this urban church. But what I am so proud of these suburban churches for doing is that as the cost of this thing began to go up and up and up and up, not because we were misspending, but because it was part of a learning curve. We were paying the dumb tax, if you will. And at any point in other situations I've been a part of, I could have seen that the suburban churches just bailing and saying, nope, I'm out. But we had said, look, we're going to step into this complexity and figure out how to do it. Now, if we had just simply brought our own contractors from out of the suburbs in here and just kind of knocked this thing out, but we wanted to work in the urban core with different people. And we learned a ton in the whole process of it. And the churches stayed with it. And it took us 3 times as long and 3 times as much money to actually get this house done. But we did it. And it didn't end up being one more story where the suburbs came in to say, oh, we want to do this great thing. And then when it got tough and complicated, we bailed. No. Hats off to this group of churches because they stayed with it, even though it was painful and it cost a lot. And I would argue, even though the co-op wasn't able to go beyond this initial stage, we got this one family into home ownership. They now have their own home. They're on a 15-year note, and they're paying less for this home than they were in this rat trap that they were living beforehand. And it's their home. They have something and they're creating wealth in the process. And we learned so much, such that I genuinely believe that this whole Good Neighbor housing program could work in other places at well. And were we to do it again, we wouldn't spend 3 times as much on a house. We learned some things along the way. And I think that's part of what the suburban church has to understand, that this is complicated and there's a learning curve that happens in the process. Stick with it. It's okay for things not to work as efficiently as you thought they would. That happens even in just the pure giveaway kinds of stuff that we do. So great, that's great. If you've got other questions, I hope that you'll take a minute and just kind of throw those out at us. So let's jump into this then. We should be on page 3 now. And I want to jump into the actual content, a little bit about Missions 3.0 for you. So first thing is, people ask the question, why do we call it Missions 3.0? Well, the reason we call it Missions 3.0 is because we wanted to leave the impression that this is simply an upgrade. We're not saying that, and neither is toxic charity or helping the hurts or any of those. Nobody that I've run into that's wrestling with this message is saying, oh, we've done it all wrong. That's not the point. It's that as our understanding of material poverty has grown, our responses to it haven't. And now we're at a point where we cannot afford to not grow in our understanding. We've got to upgrade the system, if you will. So here's what we have seen, that in the natural course of any church, that most churches start off in their mission work with what we call Missions 1.0, which is all about raising money. It's raising money to meet needs. And that's an important thing, because at that stage, churches are teaching its people to be generous. And they're also teaching their people that it's going to take financial resources to deal with some of the issues that make suffering in this world. And so, they begin to set aside a certain portion of their budget. We do different things in our church, but money becomes something that we recognize will demonstrate our priority to material poverty. So we do what we do. 10% of our budget's going to go to that or this, whatever the case may be. But eventually, money's not enough. And every church gets to the point where they start saying, well, we don't want to just give money. It feels too much like a foundation or something. Well, we want our people to get involved. And that's when churches move into what we call Missions 2.0. And that's mobilizing volunteers to make a difference. And so then churches begin to look for partners that they can, that their volunteers can get involved in, along with the financial resources of the church. And you've probably seen this and been a part of it in your own church. So 1.0 and 2.0 teaches people to give of their time, talent, and treasures to wrestle with material poverty. And what we have learned over the years is that money and volunteers all alone end up creating helping that hurts. That there's something missing in that. And there's all kinds of reasons for this. But what we have said and what we're saying and why we call this Missions 3.0 is we're saying it's not enough to simply mobilize money and volunteers. Missions 3.0 is about equipping the church to create lasting change. It's about the things that we need. It's the systems and the structures necessary to help people lift themselves out of poverty. How do we help people gain economic control of their own, such that they can take care of themselves and their family the same way you and I take care of our family? And what role can the church play? And that's an upgrade. It's not saying that we need to quit doing 1.0. It's not saying that we need to quit doing 2.0. It's saying that we need to do, in addition to those things, this third thing. And it's the calculus of compassion. And it's part of the reason why we added to our mission statement and create space for business-minded people who can help that happen. Because you can't do Missions 3.0 without business-minded people as part of the equation. So look, please understand something about Missions 3.0, and it's there in your handout. It's a framework for doing missions in the 21st century. And the end goal is all about lasting change. And we're asking the question how the church can be a catalyst for lasting, self-sustaining change for people caught in material poverty. And we've underlined it in your outline there, but look, Missions 3.0 will it's a framework. It will give you a unifying framework and a common language upon which to build a shared vision. So no church is going to build the same vision as another church. But what tends to keep us locked up is that we don't have this unifying framework. We don't have this common language to build. So consequently, we are always talking over one another. We're always wrestling with, what did you mean by this? What did you mean by that? So what we've done, or what we began to realize as we started wrestling with during our co-op days in the churches that we were working with and subsequently there, was that there was this need to kind of step back and understand the world of missions from the North American suburban church. And that if we began to understand that, we could begin to break down the pieces of this and start to look at ways that we could do what we call Missions 3.0 alongside of the 1.0 and 2.0. So Missions 3.0 as a framework is built upon three basic pillars. And understand, I'm not going to have time to go through in great detail much of this. This is really just kind of an overview of a 6-hour workshop that we do, and in fact, a 2-year learning community that it's our hope that we can get more and more churches involved in, because we think as that happens, it will accelerate the learning curve of the church, and it will begin to accelerate the ways in which the church actually participates this in new and innovative ways that begin to reshape what it looks like to work with people in material poverty. But the first pillar that we recognize, and this came from some work that I was doing with some very large churches and an invitation that we had to interact with the Rockefeller Foundation and the Global Impact Investment Network. And I had kind of Skyped the Global Impact Investment Network into this meeting with these very large church mission pastors because there was room for them at the table. And I just thought, wow, they would really get excited about this. And what happened in that was that the conversation just simply kind of, it didn't go anywhere. And I remember going back to my hotel room that night thinking, wow, these are some really smart mission pastors from some incredible churches around the country. And yet, whatever opportunity was represented in this conversation with the Rockefeller Foundation just totally went away. And I was frustrated. So eventually I kind of got a hold of myself and I started thinking this through and I began to pray, and God, help me to understand what's going on. And I did what we need to do more often than not, is that we need to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And so for a moment, I put myself in the shoes of these mission pastors. And I said, what is it that has these very capable folks so overwhelmed that they're not even interested in the potential opportunity that exists here? And And the moment I did that, it began to hit me, because I've been a pastor. I've seen all of this. And what came to me was that, oh my goodness, these poor mission pastors. Now I'm talking to you, mission pastors out there. How many, 44% of you out there are mission leaders. I began to put myself in your shoes, and I thought, oh my goodness, I know why. I think I know why. Because as a mission pastor, as you begin to think about the various stakeholders, and this is pillar number one, the key stakeholders, is that you've got these different stakeholders, all of which you're somewhat responsible for. And the first stakeholder is the volunteer. As a mission pastor, you're paid basically to provide positive volunteer experiences for the people that go to your church. And so you've got volunteers who basically want an easy volunteer experience on Saturday morning from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock, because they've got Pee Wee baseball before that, and they've got dance class after that, and they'd like it to be a multi-generational kind of a thing. I mean, you know what I'm saying. You've been there, and it's like the tension to somehow provide positive volunteer experiences for the people in your church who may not have any real understanding of the realities of poverty. That falls to you to do that. So the first stakeholder in the world of missions is the volunteer, and they have their own needs, and oftentimes those needs are not at all informed by the realities of the very people they're trying to help. And you have to deal with that. But there's a second stakeholder, and that is what we call the resource church. And the resource church includes the mission pastor, it includes the pastor, it includes the board, the mission board. It includes all of those who make decisions about how to mobilize resources into the work that they're doing out in missions. And that group has its own set of interests. It needs stories. The pastor needs a great story to tell on Christmas Eve so that they can raise more money to do more good work around the world. I mean, that's a different need than a positive volunteer experience. But this stakeholder, the resource church, needs statistics, it needs evidence, it needs stories. All of those things become this pull at you, the mission pastor, to give me that stuff. Give me the positive volunteer experience. Give me the story that I can tell. And you're trying to do all those things. But you have a third stakeholder, and that third stakeholder is what we call your partners. Most North American churches aren't doing the actual work. They're working with partners, whether it is in this country or outside of this country. You work in partnership with another organization that works with the indigenous community right there. Well, and that indigenous community is not looking for stories, and it's not looking for positive volunteer experiences. That partner is looking for resources to execute. And they're constantly pulling at you, the mission leader, for those resources. And they're getting from you the need for positive volunteer experiences right there. And then let me go to the fourth one, then come back and talk about what's happening in these four stakeholders. The fourth stakeholder in the world of missions is the actual community, or the individual, the benefactor. And so I guarantee you that whether you're talking about the urban core or any place else around the world, they're not looking and asking the question, how can we be a positive volunteer experience for suburban church? As a matter of fact, oftentimes, those communities and those individuals will tell you that they feel objectified. That when we come running in these short-term trips and we start taking pictures of them and their kids and posting them on Facebook, and we do these drive-by mission things, in and out, one and done kinds of things, it ends up feeling more like the zoo. And if, as a mission pastor, you've heard those things. And I was just sitting there in my hotel room, and I said, oh my goodness, that's it. The truth is that because of these four stakeholders, the average mission pastor spends most of their time simply trying to manage the tension between those four stakeholders. Now, is the answer to eliminate any one of those stakeholders? Absolutely not. I'd argue, and we're going to look at this just a minute, that the volunteer and the way in which we structure our volunteerism within our church ought to be a significant role in the idea of making disciples. And I'll unpack that a little bit more there. But no. Do you get rid of the resource church? Absolutely not. Do you get rid of the partners? No. Obviously, you don't get rid of the community or the individual that you're trying to help. No, the benefactor is there. The goal is, how do we begin to take the tension that currently exists in the helping that hurts type of thing and turn that tension into traction? And so a large part of what we do through Missions 3.0 is some work in helping you understand that. But we have found that just being able to identify those four stakeholders And the fact that there's a tremendous amount of tension has been incredibly helpful in a church at least taking a step back and taking a deep breath, saying, okay, maybe if we start with this piece of the framework, we can begin to create some ways in which we can change. As you saw me say earlier, the number one thing we have to change is the end goal cannot be about a positive volunteer experience. It has to be about creating lasting change for the benefactor. And that begins to shape our thinking. It's why we need to bring business-minded people into the model as well. And then we do a lot in that area, but I've got to keep going time-wise. So the second pillar, and you've got all of those in there, is what we call necessary shifts. And so I've already told you the number one is we've got to change the end goal. And we've just got to say it for what it is. And the number one pushback that I've had with most churches that I've worked with, especially the larger churches, that when I start talking about a positive volunteer experience, that's typically not met with much agreement. I've been asked not to say that, but I can't not say it. It is the number one thing that will keep the North American church from being able to genuinely provide the necessary help for people caught in material poverty. So the second thing, though, that we have to do is we have to begin to create continuums of care. We're going to talk just briefly here about what we call relief, betterment, and development. And missions, as it begins to change the end goal, then also has to begin to think in terms of how do we help people go through the whole continuum? How do we help a person in the relief stage? And then how do we help build capacity in the development stage? But then how do we actually help them? How do we build capacity in the betterment stage? And then how do we actually help them gain the necessary resources to actually move into self-sufficiency and the kinds of things that will lift themselves out of poverty? So, and those happen in continuums. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the third thing, huge shift, is we have to begin to build missional maturity. And I would argue that the church has been negligent in defining missional maturity as a key component of what it means to be a fully devoted follower of Christ. I'll unpack this real quick in just a minute for you. And then the fourth thing that we have to do is we've got to make space for the business-minded. So many of these things have to do with things that require business-minded acumen. And I'm clergy. I just don't know how to do some of the things that we're talking about. So, but our business-minded people, and we have so many of them in our churches that could do that. So I tell you what, before we get to the four practices, I just want to look at a couple of these shifts. So on the next page, on page 4, I've given you a little worksheet that we use about a shift number 2, where we're talking about create continuums of care. So one of the first things we figured out in this common language is that we had to begin to define emergency relief, individual betterment, and sustainable development in very specific terms, because when we started doing assessments, about 80% of what people said they were doing, they put under the category of development, community development. And obviously, 80% of what we're doing was not community development, or we wouldn't have toxic charity and When Helping Hurts. And so it was just having to come to some clear ideas and distinctions between the three. And so others may define them differently, but in our Missions 3.0 model, this is what we talk about. That there is an emergency relief, and it's defined as providing emergency aid to reduce temporary suffering. Individual betterment is equipping individuals and families to provide for themselves. And oftentimes, training is about individual betterment. And then the third one is sustainable development, creating conditions to increase the wealth-generating assets of a community or an individual. But it's about people at that point being able to take control of their lives and to provide for themselves the same way that I provide for me and my family. How do we do that so that people are no longer needing other people to somehow make up the difference in their life? And we've gone, if you look through this, you'll see we've got characteristics, the dynamics, what do volunteers do in the emergency relief? What do they do in individual? Because until we began to define it this clearly, we weren't getting a clear sense of what we needed to add to in this continuum. So a lot of it then is, how could we help ministries that we're already partnering with build the continuum within their own ministry? But in many cases, it's not about asking a ministry to do all three. Some ministries are really good at doing one or two. then how do we help connect those ministries to other ministries that do the remaining piece? How do we even help fund the collaboration between organizations such that a person can move from relief to betterment to development and not need this ongoing help? And that requires this whole idea of continuum of care. It begins, though, with a clear understanding of what you mean by relief, betterment, and development. And then the other shift that I want to just take a minute to look at real quickly here is this necessary shift of building missional maturity. And I mean, this part was easier for me from my pastoral background, and it was just kind of an expansion of me beginning to see some things differently in the latter years of my pastoral life. And what I began to realize was that my understanding of disciple making was primarily around the idea of sharing the gospel, of helping people with spiritual disciplines and spiritual knowledge, and then building in them this desire to make disciples of other people such that they would have the same spiritual disciplines and spiritual knowledge. And what I realized was that there's really three major tracks that are part of what we would call building missional maturity. And that third track ought to be seen in my mind, in my understanding of what it means to be a fully devoted follower of Christ. So we all know as pastors that for a person to be a fully devoted follower, they've got to have certain spiritual disciplines. I mean, that's a given. You need to know how to pray. You need to know how to read your Bible. You need to know why tithing is important. You need to know why being a part of a church. You need to know all of those things, because they build in you, they strengthen your soul. Those disciplines, like exercise builds the body, those disciplines build the soul. And we want our people to know that. And we know that there's no way that you can become a fully devoted follower except that you internalize those, that you actualize those disciplines in your life. But we also know that there's certain spiritual knowledge. And so as pastors, it was really easy for me to help people learn the spiritual disciplines, or I shouldn't say easy, it came to second nature. That was all part of being trained, but also spiritual knowledge. It was important for you to know who Christ was, what he did for you, why Easter is important. It's important for you to know the books of the Bible, the Old Testament from the New Testament. It's important for you to know the role of the church and why the church is what the church is. It's important for you to know the Trinitarian God and how he is three in one. All of that is knowledge that becomes important. Without that knowledge, you don't become this disciple that you're supposed to be. And we tend to leave it at that. I would argue that if we were going to see the work that God is doing in this world as primarily a redemptive work, he is redeeming all of creation. He's redeeming our souls, but he's also redeeming all of creation. He cares about human relationships. He cares about marriage. He cares about all of these things. And that he invites us in to be co-creators with him in the redeeming work of all of creation. And I would argue that missional maturity is showing people that they have something to bring into that. What is it that God is asking you to do to co-create with him that would make this world look more like what it's supposed to look like? And we do that. The best place to do that is through our mission work. And I have found, and we call them the 3 E's, I have found that the best way to begin to push a person to understand that God didn't just save you for yourself, that God wants to use you and what you do, even right now. It's not about becoming a preacher or a pastor or a missionary. It's about using the gifts that God has given you right now to be a redemptive force in the world. And so what I have found is that the average person begins to understand these things better through a simple process of expose, engage, and then what I like to call redemptive entanglement. Is that, you'll see this, this, mission pastors and others, any of you that have been a part of this. I mean, the first time that you went on a mission trip, or the first time that you were confronted with people in material poverty, it broke your heart. I mean, the exposure itself did things to you. It wrecked you. I know it did me, and my whole world was turned upside down. But then I came back, and the next thing you know, I'm just kind of back to where I was. but what I found is that if you can move yourself from just that one and done exposure to engagement, which is now a person saying, okay, you can count on me. So in a mission work, it might be that you do a once a month volunteer thing in which you're simply trying to put people's heart in harm's way. And if you do it right in a continuum, you'll be able to protect from the whole idea of helping that hurts because you're doing it in a continuum. We explained even that more about that as we work through this whole process. But then what you want to do is you want to push a person a little more and say, listen, we've got a mentoring program. We've got a school reading project that we're doing. We've got a once a month this. We've got a once a week that. We've got a every other month. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to engage people to give of their time and their talent to make a difference in somebody else's life. Can you see what happens then? In that moment, you're pushing a person a little bit further into their commitment level. And then what I have found is that as you push a person further and further into this idea that, listen, to be a fully devoted follower of Jesus is to be redemptively entangled in the work that he's doing in the lives of others, that they will come at some point to this redemptive entanglement. They will find that thing that they cannot not do. And we've all seen that in some people. I mean, the redemptive entanglement is that, you know what, I couldn't not do this if I tried. The best way that I know to describe redemptive entanglement is the way we feel towards our children. I mean, we cannot not show up for our kids. If my kids have done certain things to me that if anybody else had done them to me, I would love you at a distance. But when it's our kids, we cannot not show up. Look what happens then in the life of a follower of Christ when they're not just building spiritual disciplines. They're not just taking their quiet times and all those things. They're not just learning more about, but all of a sudden they're putting themselves, they're taking the gifts and the graces, they're bringing the resources of their own life and world to bear upon the needs of others. And can you see what begins to happen? I mean, things start to get personal at that point. And I would argue that's the kind of disciple that Christ is looking for. One that practices the inward things and the kinds of things that build up their soul. One that is growing in knowledge of who he is and what he's done for us and what his role is supposed to be in this world. And those who are consistently putting themselves out there. They are his hands, they are his feet. We are his witnesses in this world. And I'm suggesting that right now, there are things that business-minded people can do in this space for material poverty, unlike any other time in human history. And what I long to see is for churches to begin to develop this kind of a robust understanding of disciple making in these three strands right there. So a lot of what we do in Missions 3.0 is this continuum of expose, engage, entangle, and looking at discipleship in these three categories: disciplines, knowledge, and missional maturity. We don't say much in the way of spiritual disciplines and spiritual knowledge because every church already has the things that they do. What we're trying to do is help you build that third category of missional maturity as part of the disciple-making process. And by the way, the whole idea of redemptive entanglement, isn't that the story of Christianity? Isn't that what makes Christianity different than any other religion? That God became redemptively entangled with us. He put skin on, and he came down here, and he lived among us, and he could not do everything necessary to redeem us. I mean, we're called to simply reincarnate his incarnation through our own lives in the work that we do and the ways in which we work and serve other people. So that's one of the shifts that we believe that you need to make in the Missions 3.0. So then let me jump then into the third pillar, which is what we call the four practices. So we've talked in short that you've got these four key stakeholders, these necessary shifts that you've got to begin to make in your church. And then you've got to jump into what we call the four practices. And these are things that you just have to do over time. And the first practice is this: you have to reframe understanding and expectations. In other words, missions goes on in the life of a church because you have these assumptions, these understandings, and these expectations. One of those expectations, though it doesn't get said, is that this has to have a very positive volunteer experience for our folks. I mean, that pastor from that urban church made it clear that whether we intended it to be that way or not, there was this expectation that he needed to provide positive volunteer experiences. And over again, as I have spent time with ministries on the front lines doing this, they all say the same things, that the positive volunteer experience is wearing us out because we're not able to really get the things that we really need in terms of human resources and volunteerism. And we're constantly having to create work so that people feel good about doing something in the hopes that there will be resources at the end to do what we need. So we do a lot of work with things like Bridges Out of Poverty, the Circles program, various, we had Marlo Fox come and speak with us from Think Tank and the work that they're doing, Chalmers Center and their work. I mean, how do we begin to reframe people's understanding about poverty and expectations of the volunteer? A lot of the work that Ruby Payne has done that helps inform middle class about the rules of poverty and various things. I mean, until we understand those things, we'll continue to stumble over ourselves, and we won't do the hard work of examining these underlying expectations. But how do we do that? One of the big things that we work with marketplace people or business-minded people. Please don't hear me saying that I think the answer to all these problems is business-minded people. Hey, business-minded people, oftentimes you're as much a part of the problem as any other person in this equation. And the reason that I find that to be true is that the average business-minded person does not understand the concept of patient capital. And they don't understand what's going on in the world of poverty and a cash flow world and things like that. So part of what we have to do in our Missions 3-point work is help business-minded people understand the difference between the Wall Street mentality that they have and the street where poverty is lived on a daily basis. And there's incredible things that can be done, but there's a learning curve that has to happen there as well. So that's the first practice. And there's a lot of things. We try to connect churches to resources and ways that you can do that over time. The second thing that we do is we say that you're going to have to champion collaboration. You cannot do this on your own. And it's not only you collaborating with other churches, other partners, but sometimes it's you collaborating with other suburban churches, so that there's these collective resources from the suburban church that are working together to help resource things in indigenous communities. But it's also sometimes collaborating with a number of indigenous partners. In other words, ministries that are working in the context that you're trying to work. How do you help create the kind of collaboration where a number of organizations could work together such that a person could move through that whole cycle of relief, betterment, and development? And this is we can do this. It just takes more energy and more effort and a willingness to step into some of the complexity. The third thing the third practice is we have to begin to gather data and tackle outcomes. If we say that we're trying to reach sustainable solutions, if we're trying to change things in a lasting way, then we've got to be able to collect data, because that data will help inform decisions, and it will also tell us whether or not we're moving the needle. So we're doing a number of things with the church-school partnership here in the Kansas City area to help collect data for that. And we're trying to build partnerships with other faith-based groups that think that data collection is important, and how we use that data to inform our decisions and get better at the things that we say they want to do. Because I believe, again, the church could be a leader in this particular space right there. And then the fourth area that we're talking about is the fourth practice is to cultivate innovation. And that means a willingness to try some things that have never been tried before. And Mission Pastor, this is the place where many of your business-minded people would fit the best. And what I find is that it's just really hard. It's hard for us as pastors to create space for business-minded people and then get out of the way. And my experience where it has worked, it has been because pastors create space for business-minded people to try things kind of under the radar, And then we kind of get out of the way and help remove the barriers and the bureaucracy and that kind of stuff, that oftentimes the right kind of business-minded people, they're problem solvers. And as often as not, they'll pay for their own idea. And if it fails, it'll fail fast. And when it succeeds, they tend to want to get something up and going and turn it over to the people that can keep those things going. And that we're just not good at creating that kind of space and cultivating innovation that will invite business-minded people into the conversation to be a part of the problem solving of these things that could create sustainable solutions. But I'm convinced that the moment we do, Pastor, you will find in your congregation so many business-minded people that are dying to find an outlet through their church. And one of two things happens. Not a week goes by and then I don't get a phone call from somebody, some business-minded person or some ministry out there, just frustrated because you've got baby boomers that are retiring healthier and wealthier than any time in history. And yet they don't want to be a part of helping that hurts. And they find little or no expressions of that through their local church, but they would love to do it. So what do? They do one of two things. They either check out altogether and just go take another couple of strokes off their golf game or buy another house or whatever. Or they go find a not-for-profit or a ministry outside the church and they give their A game there. All I'm saying is that they would love to give their A game through the church if the church could find a way to harness their A game. They don't want to just write checks. They want to be, and I'm the first to admit there's a lot of complexities that kind of get caught up in that. But if we're going to be the organization that helps people lift themselves out of material poverty, if the church is going to play a significant role in that space, it's going to be because we have figured out how to create space for business-minded people and that they can begin to do it through their church, because we will unleash untold resources through individual congregations that we otherwise will simply miss. So those are the main pillars. And one is understanding your stakeholders. The second one is some major shifts that you have to make in the culture. And then just some ongoing practices that will take time. And so all of that kind of then takes me to the idea of change and how much time that it takes. So second to last page, I'm sorry, that you have in your handout there is, it's a diagram that's built off of the Kuhn's paradigm shift. And all I've just basically adapted his concept of the 5 stages of a paradigm shift to what we've seen happens in the life of the average person or the average church as they try to go through this. And that I would say most churches will find themselves somewhere already in this paradigm shift. And the rest, my guess is that you, because you're on this call right here, are somewhere at least in the area of step 2 or step 3. So, we say that it takes 2 to 3 years to change the trajectory of your church. That if you're looking to move in this direction, it's going to take you 2 to 3 years just to change the trajectory, because you're already going in another direction. And just starting to identify the difference between relief, betterment, and development, the need to build continuums, to just admit that you have prioritized a positive volunteer experience over just about everything else, that takes time. And it hurts and it's hard work. But until we can be that kind of honest with ourselves, we won't get there. So it's going to take 2 to 3 years to change the trajectory. It's going to take 3 to 5 years to change the narrative and the stories that are coming out. But I'm telling you, once that begins to happen, the stories will change, the narrative will change, and people's understanding will change. And what seems complex now will just seem natural then. But it takes time. And no church that is unwilling to commit itself to this 3 to 5 years will find itself making any kind of significant difference in this space. It just can't be done. It's just that hard. So, you look through the 5 steps in this Kuhn diagram. You in step 1, you're in this accepted belief and practice. And in other words, everything is fine. We don't need to change anything. Well, I would say that was kind of the way things were up until about 15 years ago. We just need to keep giving more money and doing this and helping them in this way. But so much has happened that most churches, and certainly the world of secular philanthropy has come to a model crisis down to step 3. So in the step 2, there's a model drift. Our understanding starts to drift. We begin to say, wait a minute, is this war on poverty really working? Did we make the right decisions there? And then at some point we come into 3rd stage, which is a model crisis. It becomes, the model is so broken that it no longer serves as a reliable guide. I mean, that's why we got books like Toxic Charity When Helping Hurts. That's why Poverty Cure put out the movie that they did. It had gotten to the point where everybody was going, okay, it's broken. And then in step 4, it's this model revolution. We begin to have these kind of serious conversations about new models. And our last page, we have some stuff about SAT talks. And part of what we've been doing through Significant Matters is we've been trying to find those folks out there who are at stage 4, who are creating new models out there, and saying to the church, look, don't panic. We can do this. And here are some folks that are doing it, and they tell us their best 18-minute story, and we put it up on the internet, and we're saying, look, here's what's happening. Everything from soup kitchens to business as mission in the 1040 window. It's a way of looking at poverty alleviation in a whole different way. It's about how to create human flourishing. It's about how the church can be a part of that. And then you get to the 5th shift, or the 5th step, and it's a paradigm shift in which significant things begin to happen. And we're not there. The church is nowhere close to that right now. But I would argue that it's God's desire that the church be a part of this. And so part of what we do with the church is help them understand where you're at in this right now, help them understand it's going to take some time. If you want to do this in a weekend, not going to happen. If you're willing to commit 3 to 5 years to this, there's some incredible things that could happen in and through the work of your church. If you jump on page 7, then a quick vision of what we have for the Church of North America. And we haven't had any other questions as we've gone through this. And so I'm either just talking too fast or covering it all, or I don't know. But I will say this, if you've got additional questions, please feel free to put them out there now. We still have some time. And if not, if you think of others, then please feel free to email me those. But on page 7, a quick vision of the Church for North America, of what we're hoping that we can be a part of. And that is that our goal over the next 5 years is to establish 100 communities of practice across the United States, of churches willing to work with this framework, this language, and this common framework. And we've got ways that we can help. And if you're not comfortable with this, fine. Find some other framework that makes sense, and pull together some churches that will work together around this so that you can start to move the needle. And I would argue that if there's a better way, then do it that way. But what we can do for your community is we can come in and do these workshops. It's about a 6-hour workshop in which you try to bring people from your church together that are decision makers, that can help think and help drive some of the things that could move you in this trajectory over the next 3 to 5 years. And you can do this within your community. We've got resources. We've got some sample workshops that we've done in other places around the country. We can show you what those look like. And we will probably be developing an online version of this workshop as well, the 6-hour workshop. But then we believe the biggest change will happen when churches begin to gather together in what we would call peer learning accelerators, such that 6 to 8 churches can work together over a period of 2 years, not on any kind of common thing, but to just simply be a part of a group that's working the same framework. And it's built on an act and learn model in which you come together. We facilitate a process in which you build action plans for the next 6 months in and among your 4 stakeholders, with these paradigms, these shifts that we were talking about, and then in these practices? And how do you push those things in 6-month intervals down the road so that you can begin to see the changes that you need to over the next 3 to 5 years? It won't happen on its own. It just takes time. Anyhow, peer learning accelerators, these kind of cohorts help a church. It accelerates your own learning curve in the process. And then ultimately, we hope that we can begin to establish these communities of practice. The whole idea of a group of churches within a geographical region that are working together and creating new models and are demonstrating things. And then what we ultimately see is being able to take a lot of those and actually do SAT talks with them and various other things to kind of spread the word. Here's what this church is doing. Here's what this group is doing in this place. Let's all learn from one another. And to the extent that we do that, I believe the church can become an integral part in what it looks like to create human flourishing through the work of missions. So last page is a little something about the SAT talks that I mentioned to you. There's over 60 videos out there, everybody from Bob Lupton to Michael Miller, Florence Mulendi, Rick Rousseau. I mean, all of these are pioneers, innovators that are doing some incredible things, and you can see what the church is doing in these areas, both as a way to encourage you as potential partners to work with, but more than anything, to kind of ignite your own imagination as to what could be if we believed God would work through us in this type of mission. Could the church not become just a key player in the whole work around poverty and human flourishing? I believe with all my heart that God has intended for that, and he's intended his church to be a part of that. And that's what we here at Significant Matters are all about. We would love to continue this conversation with you, and we'd love to work with your church if we had the opportunity. So we've got a few more minutes if there's any more questions or looking. And I don't see that we have any. So let me close then and say thank you. Thank you for taking this time. I hope that it's been valuable for you, and I hope that we get a chance to meet in the not so distant future, and that we might be able to help your church as it seeks to be the influence that I believe God wants us to be in our communities and world. So thanks again, and please get in touch with us. There'll be some information at the end of this where you can reach us. Again, thanks and God bless.